Welcome to Cultivating Courage, a podcast exploring fear, courage, and stepping into a life filled with purpose, connection, and love. In this week's episode, I'm chatting with Coach Katie O'Malley about women's leadership development and creating a brave space so that we can all show up authentically to the office every day. Welcome to another episode of Cultivating Courage. I'm your host, Kristin Robinson, and this week I am super excited to have guest Katie O'Malley on. Hi. Welcome.
Thank you.
So Katie is a leadership coach. She has over 15 years of experience. She has a master's in counseling. She's a board certified coach. She is the senior associate director of leadership development at Chicago Booth, which for those of you that aren't familiar is the University of Chicago's MBA program. And she is also the founder of Encourage Coaching. We are so stoked to have you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to come here today.
Yes. So when Katie and I were planning this, we had obviously a little pre-call and we talked about all the different things we could talk about. And a couple of topics emerged, and the one that kind of flushed out ended up being women and leadership development, which I'm super excited to talk about. But first, is there anything that you would like people to know about you that I didn't mention?
I mean, you captured a lot of the headlines. I think the other thing, I'm a Chicago native, so born and raised. I have left 4 times, and I have returned every time because it is the best city in the whole world.
That is quite an endorsement, especially given our winters.
Yes.
And you were in Texas for a while, right?
I was.
So to come back from like
Austin,
summer all year to Chicago winter says a lot about Chicago.
Well, in Austin, you are in an air-conditioned box for 4 months out of the year, basically from May until September. And in Chicago, you're just in a heated box for 4 months from December until March. So pick your poison.
Yeah,
I prefer to be in the heat. I love
that. What's your favorite thing about Chicago?
The people.
Yeah.
The people in the community.
Yes, 100%. Like that's what I say all the time. There's just something about Chicago. You have the wonderful opportunities and experiences that a big city has to offer, but you have the Midwest vibe.
Absolutely.
And people are just so kind and generous, and it's amazing.
I think generous is the perfect word.
Yeah. I love Chicago. Yeah, if I ever leave, it'll be to like move to an island and just live like the beach life full time.
And that is what my partner is trying to convince me of. He's like, can't you just do this virtual coaching like all the time from an island somewhere? He is from the UK, so he loves Chicago too. He can't get over the sunshine in the summers and all of the seasons that we get. Yeah. And still, I think in an ideal world, he's like, I'd like to be on an island full time.
Yeah, I that's my dream someday. Well, that or like just be a nomad and just like hop around the world, like, and move every 4 to 6 months to like somewhere else in the world. We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay. So back to the topic at hand. So the first thing I kind of want to talk about because of your coaching business and Encourage Coaching, what you focus on executive coaching, right?
Executive leadership and career.
Okay.
It's actually interesting. When I started the practice, there was a segment of the population I was really targeting to work with. And it's the folks who are usually underrepresented in leadership roles. So women and communities of color, or under-resourced in the workplace.
Yeah.
Again, women and
Often
communities
the same,
of color, to provide coaching services that are accessible for them to advance their career, or if they like where they are, or we like where we are, that we can gain the necessary knowledge and language that we would need to advance, whether that be in interviews or to talk the talk that often gets people through a door.
Yeah.
And so it is not the population I am predominantly working with. A lot of executive coaching that is happening, working with a couple corporate clients with their leadership teams and some organizational strategy. And then a lot of Gen Z folks right out of college who never visited their career development centers, and really looking at how are we going to find you a career path that aligns with the things that are motivating to you, that you value, so it doesn't feel soul crushing on a daily basis. And so really two very different segments of the population. So yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. And so one of the things that, and I didn't even mention how we met. Okay. So backtrack for a hot minute. So, Katie was teaching a class on courageous leadership at Next Door, which is a cafe here in Chicago, which is awesome. They offer all of these free classes on so many different topics. So before we jump into leadership development, I would love for you to define for our audience, like, what is courageous leadership, regardless of gender? Like, how do you define that?
Sure. So I loved that we met there too.
Yes.
It was a really great workshop that day. So the Courageous Leadership Workshop, which is about leveraging your authenticity in the workplace, I really provided a definition of what I thought courageous leadership was. And it actually takes from two different schools of thought or two different frameworks. The first is the social change model for leadership development, which really looks at leadership being a values-based process that energizes folks to create meaningful change in their selves, in groups, or in their communities. And then Dr. Brene Brown, who is a PhD of social work, she has a new Netflix special.
Yes, it's amazing.
The Call to Courage, several books. She's brilliant.
One of her books is on my table right there.
Yep, that's The Gifts of Imperfection. I see it. She said, and it was something that struck me so deeply about 5 years ago, that back in the day, like Greek times, when they were still speaking Greek, Latin.
Totally. Speaking their native tongue.
Yes. Yeah. Courage, the root of the word, the Latin root is core, which means heart. And so courage back then used to mean to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. So when you begin to think about it, courageous leadership being those things that you can do on a daily basis that are authentically you, and are aligned with your values, so that you can move through the world leading in this very authentic way.
Yeah.
So combining those two things is really how I view it.
Yes. And I think that that flows so well into the conversation around leadership development and women's place in that process, because we were talking off air before we started this, that leadership development programs specifically for women, it's necessary, because right now I think what we experience is you either like are just part of the group and you accommodate everyone else and you kind of take on what everyone else expects you to do in terms of your role and how you act, basically that you need to adapt to that space. And so how do we take that on, and like how do we reconcile being who we are, like that courageous leadership, like being authentically us, and also who society and our organizations want us to be, which is often a mixed message too. I'm not sure what the question in there is.
Yeah, no, I mean, the question, it's our ability to be viewed as leaders, or even to develop our own leadership identity, which we need to integrate into the core of ourselves, is flawed from the very outset.
Yes.
And so if you look at something like the leadership identity development model, there's 6 stages of it. And with my students, I showed them the model. So the first is you come to an awareness, like you see a leader, and you're like, leadership, it's this thing. Then you have an experience of being alongside a leader. And you're like, oh yeah, this is a role that people
Right.
have. Then you step into this I leadership, where it's like leadership is a position. If I hold a position, I am a leader. Then it's, I have this awareness that the leadership is not just about me. It's about my team and creating change. And so then you move into that.
Yeah.
Then you receive feedback about how you have done in those two areas.
Yep.
And then you integrate that into your leadership identity. And the question that I posed to my students last weekend when we were doing the Women's Lead Hership program at Booth was, at which point in this model, or at what point does this model fail women?
Yeah.
And it was fascinating.
Yeah, I'm sure.
To hear the responses, which was, they're like, it has to be at the feedback part.
No.
It has to be at the integration part.
No.
Where do you think it is?
The very beginning.
The awareness part?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a trick question. It fails us at every part.
Right.
Because whether it's we're coming to the awareness and then we don't see people who look like us in those roles, or we're having an experience where we're seeing women not being allowed to take on those roles. We either have an experience being a leader, or are not given the opportunity to have that I leadership position because we're not viewed as qualified. And then you get to that feedback piece, which is inherently flawed around the language that gets used.
Yeah.
Because what happens is what the research is really showing is that men are often reviewed on their performance and their outputs, and women are reviewed. Sorry, I got that messed
Backwards.
up. Men are reviewed on their potential. Women are reviewed on their performance.
Actual performance.
And so when we start to look at how promotions happen, especially earlier in the career for a woman, you haven't had the time to prove all that much.
Right.
Even though you might have a huge amount of potential that's shining through, that's not what you're being evaluated on. Similarly,
Right.
a man in that same role who is early career still hasn't had the same amount of opportunities or experiences as you, but is being reviewed in a different way,
Right.
and evaluated in a different way, and that's on his potential.
Right. So let's talk quick about the gap that exists, because it does exist. If you look at numbers from, when men and women are starting their careers, and then look at, the people that are in leadership and the ratio or the numbers there, it's very different. So let's look at those numbers.
Yeah. So there's a great resource from McKinsey & Co. They're a brilliant, well-known consulting firm that's really investing a lot of time and resources in women in the workplace. So their Women in the Workplace 2018 report looks at 462 companies. And what they're really looking at is, what is the experience like for a woman in those workplaces? And if we think about the corporate pipeline from entry level all the way up to the C-suite, what Kristin was really referring to is they did an analysis of these 462 companies to see how is it that basically the same number of men and women are entering their workplace. So 52% male, 48% female. But then you get to the top and it's 78% male in the C-suite, 22% female, or female identified across that C-suite. How did we get there? And what they really saw was the biggest divergence happening in the very first promotion that took place to manager, which in a lot of companies will happen in the second year, and how flawed the performance evaluations are, and the feedback process is, because what we then see is this huge split where a significantly larger population of men are being promoted to manager to women. So on average, for every 100 males that are promoted to manager, only 79 females are. So you see that widen, and then the same thing just keeps happening and extrapolates out. And so that's an average, right? That number should ring a bell. 79 cents on the dollar for every 100 men that are promoted, 79 women are promoted. And so when we think about white women, Asian women, Latino women, those numbers are actually pretty similar. But for Black women, for every 100 white men who are promoted, only 60 Black women are promoted. And there is a steep drop off from other racial identities in that gender community.
Yeah, which is crazy when you actually think about it, because I think as a woman, I have my coaching business, but I also work in corporate America right now. I work in a very like man dominated industry. But regardless, I mean, I think you, I don't know, maybe want to believe that it's not as big of a difference as it really is, but it just is. So I love the fact that there's being research and work done around this topic. And I love that there's now structures and theories and models for specifically leadership development for women. So I'd love to talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. And can I say one more thing on this topic?
Yes.
One of the things I want to be sure not to do is to demonize men in this.
100%.
And so it's interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with the Harvard Implicit Association test, the Harvard IATs.
No.
It's a really interesting set of assessments that looks at where do you hold bias? And it's broken out into several. I think they have more than a dozen now, but there's one on race, ethnicity. They also have one on gender. And so Nate Silver from 538, the guy who predicts the World Series and presidential outcomes, he took a look at the assessments, the implicit association test assessments that were taken.
Say that 10 times fast.
Exactly. And so aggregated 400,000 responses. And what he found was that of the men who were in that group, 30% of those men held a negative bias towards women who took the implicit association test. For women who took that IAT, 42% of women held a negative bias against other women. Yeah. And so it is not, this part is the part that is not so gendered. Yeah. We are all responsible. And there are also things that we can be doing as women to help each other.
Yes, 100%. Like that's one of the things that I want to touch on at some point is, how do we as women support other women, not just as you're climbing, the corporate ladder, not just how are you supporting the women below you, but how are you supporting, your peers? How are you supporting women that might be higher up than you? There's so many ways to do it and be aware. I mean, I think being just aware of your biases is a huge component of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about leadership development for women a little bit. I specifically am really interested in the piece around identity work.
Sure.
Because I think that's so huge for everyone, not just women, but because there are these mixed messages about not only what does leadership look like, but how should women specifically be leaders? And that's a mixed message too. So I really want to talk a little bit about the identity work and the importance of that.
Absolutely.
And kind of what that means and looks like.
So identity is a central component of who we are, right?
Yes.
So I talked about leadership identity a few minutes ago and how do we integrate that into our core self. But our leadership identity is inextricably linked to who we are as human people.
Yeah.
And so who we are is how we lead. And to try and separate those two things and just say leadership is a set of skills or competencies, to me is insane.
Yeah.
That because part of leadership, is how are you, activating the the energy of others towards meaningful change.
Yes.
But in order to do that, you really have to understand yourself first.
Yeah. You can't create a safe space for other people to be who they are and live kind of what they see as their purpose if you aren't doing that yourself, I don't think.
Correct.
I mean, I could be wrong, but
yeah. And it's, and I think we touched on this too a bit at Next Door in the workshop, not so much creating safe spaces, but how are we creating as leaders, brave spaces for our peers, our colleagues, our bosses, the folks who may report to us, to show up and bring their full identities into work.
Yeah.
Because when we have to expend time and energy pretending to be something that we're not, which a lot of women have to do, or to be something else entirely, that is cognitive and effective energy that we cannot expend to do the actual work we were hired to do and to create the change we were hired to create.
Right. Right. So then that's directly affecting performance. It's affecting output. It's affecting the efficiency of your team, which then, to come full circle, then is affecting the feedback you're receiving about your performance.
Absolutely.
Which is huge. Yeah.
And so when we think about identity, you can talk about it in so many ways, but from having the same background as me in counseling, three components, right? You have your ways of thinking, your ways of feeling, and your ways of behaving. And if at any point those three sides of the triangle are not congruent, you are more at risk for behaviors that are driven by anxiety, depression, that are really derailing you in the workplace because the way that you think can't match the way you want to feel, or the way that you feel can't match the behavior you want to show up. And it's navigating an internal struggle that then eventually hinders you from being an effective team member, being an effective leader.
Because it's exhausting. So so there's a multitude of different leadership development programs specifically designed for women. Some are company specific. I know there's lots of companies that have leadership development programs for women internally. And then there's also external programs that women that maybe don't have the opportunity at their company to partake in that sort of program can go and find. Regardless, I think there's probably some similarities around the programs. So what are some of the core structures or components of leadership development programs? Identity work being one. We can talk more about that if you'd like. Or if there's other key components that you think are really important pieces of the programs. Yeah.
So I mean, with leadership development, the important thing I think to always remember is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
Leadership, to a certain extent, requires followers. That if you are really an exceptional leader, you are trying to create more leaders from those followers, right? And so there is the identity piece, but then there's also the group and community piece that comes into leadership development as well. And those are two avenues that I think often get overlooked, especially in women's leadership development programs. So we were chatting, and it's very much like, oh, there are all these skills that people need to learn to become a great leader, or competencies, or how do you flex a personality trait to show up as more assertive without being seen as aggressive, which is a double bind often for women. With the idea being, we'll just have all women be in the space, run the same leadership program, and it'll be fine, because it's the women that need to fix themselves to fit in the system that was not built for them, which is a complete fallacy. The work that I try to do, and what I'm trying to bring both to encourage in my work at Booth, is how are we creating opportunities for women to really explore and own the whole of their identity in a very holistic way.
We're welcoming Winston to the podcast, you guys. I'm dog sitting this weekend.
He's the best, Winston.
He's our mascot today. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. So looking at that identity piece, but then it's not just let's learn this set of skills. It's how are we able to start diminishing the impacts of bias in the workplace, without it just being completely on our shoulders, but developing that awareness together as a group or as a community. What are the strategies that we can impose as individuals? What are the strategies we can leverage as a group, to really, hey bud, to really start to allow the leadership development to unfold, because too often it gets stifled, because the opportunities are not, if they are presented, they are not given to the woman,
Right.
or we're encountering one of 4 different types of bias. And so even the awareness piece, I think, like you were saying earlier, is central, both for identity and just what is happening in terms of how we've been socialized that we
Yeah.
may not even be recognizing.
Right.
Earlier, before we were even on, you had
Yeah.
asked like, "Ooh, when did you become interested in this?" And I think the truth is, I've always been interested,
Yeah.
based on just from a young age, like, oh, why does this boy get to do that and I'm not allowed to do that, and being super curious about
Yeah.
it, all the way up to my collegiate and then workplace experiences. But I think where it became most poignant for me was when I first started at Booth. I was coaching one of our second year students who's about to graduate, and she identified as a woman and was very much like, Katie, I'm just so afraid because I know being a woman is a weakness and I don't want to be weak in my new job.
Yeah.
And my heart, like,
Yes.
I can only imagine the look on my face. And as a coach, you want to stay as neutral as
Yep.
possible. And I felt in that moment almost as though I shouldn't.
Yeah.
Not that I couldn't, but
Right.
that it would be irresponsible to not try and work with her to reframe
Yes.
what is the power in being a woman. And
Yeah.
I don't think that is an isolated isolated feeling.
Experience or feeling. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably more common than people realize. But as women, we don't necessarily even talk about that with each other. So it's, yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking a little bit to think that, you know, you've just completed one of the top programs in the country, and you still think of yourself as weak because of how you gender identify. So what did you say? Tell us what happened.
So we started to explore. I'm like, okay, so I hear what you're saying, and I want to honor that, because I'm sure the experiences that you've had are data
Validating
pieces
that.
to back that up. What can we do to think about what are the strengths of being a woman that you might be bringing to the table? And the ideas that she brought out were being collaborative, being inquisitive, really being able to synthesize information because she was listening. The struggle was, how do I speak that back out once I've synthesized it, because it's not my place. And so starting to then coach around, well, let's develop strategies for you to share your brilliance, because you holding on to it and keeping it to yourself doesn't serve anyone.
Right.
And then it seemed to connect for
Yeah.
her.
Yeah.
So that's where we went with it.
Yeah. That's, it's so important. And I think it's especially important for women, but for everyone to recognize that you have a voice and that your voice matters, and that, like you said, keeping it to yourself is not benefiting anyone. It's creating probably a struggle internally for yourself, and you never know who needs to hear what you have to say, whether it's corporate or just your day-to-day life. So to take a turn
We can
from
turn.
what we're talking about, like, what would you say are some strategies or some tips that you could give to our audience about owning your voice?
Sure.
Yeah.
So one of the other really interesting pieces of research that came out of the McKinsey report was this idea that women believe themselves to be the only one in the workplace having the experience that they're having. or that if they are at the table or there's already a woman at the table, there can only be the one. Which again, we have been socialized to believe is true, and it's just not. I think it was the notorious RBG, who had been asked like, ooh, what is it going to take for there to be, an equal number of women on the Supreme Court as men, or five women and 4 men. She's like, why are we stopping there? What if we had a full Supreme Court of women? And the journalists like dropped they're like, what are you even talking about? How could that possibly be? As though it was this crazy idea. And so one of the things is challenging that narrative, right? That one, there can only be one woman at the table, because what we also know is that when women are on teams that are dominated by men, often what they experience is a performance attribution bias. And so all of the good stuff that is happening on the team will never be credited to them if there is something that goes wrong on that team, because they are the only one. That is where they will be singled out in that negative way. But women on teams with that are predominantly other women, or on a team solely comprised of women, everybody wins in that moment. That collaboration and that type of collaborative effort is actually rewarded.
Right.
And so one of the questions I've gotten from students before is like, oh, when I go into the workplace, what if I'm on a team and I'm the only woman? What am I supposed to do? So thinking about strategies around that, how are you bringing on or suggesting other women are brought onto the team, right? Being curious. So always approaching things from a counseling way, from counseling speak. I'm wondering what it would be like if Jenny from accounting came onto this team too. Or I'm wondering if we could explore why I'm the only woman on this team, to start getting other people thinking about it, right? But in situations like that, the important thing to do is, if you are the only one, making sure you are tracking all of your achievements, connecting with another woman who may not be, if they're not on that team, who can be looking out for things that you achieve, so you can track those as well. Because so often, we often see the wonderful things that we achieve as just doing the work, where it's actual achievements that you need to be able to share for yourself. Also, anytime possible, finding a champion. And that champion doesn't always have to be your supervisor. It can be someone working alongside you to say, geez, Kristin has done this, this, and this. Because what we know when we promote other women, that gets rewarded. But when we self-promote, it is viewed in a very negative way, and is often, we are often penalized for that on performance evaluations.
So this has me thinking too, just how, to your point earlier about group and community, and not just the individual, woman bringing other women along, like how do we change this? And so that's one question,
How do we
which
change
is a
it?
really big question. Like, how do we but how do we make it that we're not the one woman on the team, and we're also the only one asking these curious questions? So that would be one question. And then my other question is it changing? Like, I think about my nieces who are, high school and junior high age, and I just wonder, is it changing for them? And so are you seeing in your work at Booth and your work as a coach, are you seeing generational differences in how women are holding the space for themselves and for each other?
Yeah, and that is,
and men, and do you see it as men holding this space differently for women as well?
What I see is the desire to do what you are talking about. What I also see is just us as human people lacking the tools and the courage to be able to do that, because it is so outside of the way
Yes.
that we've grown up and the way that we've moved through the world, me for 36 and a half years, other folks for however many years, to start to do things that are in stark contrast to how we've been behaving. That kind of change takes a long time for individuals. So just imagine how long it takes for groups and communities. What I will say is I do believe generationally there is a shift happening where generations, Gen X, baby boomer generations, very much of and these are generalizations here.
Yes.
But I went through this really hard, rough climb to the top of my industry, of my profession in this company. That is just the way that it is.
Yeah.
It is a badge of honor to be able to do that. And I think what we are starting to see, and I'm so glad about, is reframing the badge of honor as actually a barrier to other women succeeding.
Right.
And so how are we taking down that barrier for other women to come along with us? Because what we know, like when we're on teams, the more of us who are there, the better chance we have of raising all of the voices, right? Often, even I'm sure you've heard about in President Obama's White House, how women there would amplify each other's voices. So somebody would say something, then somebody else would say it, then somebody else would say it, till finally it was heard.
Yeah.
So it's the amplification of good ideas and the amplification of attribution.
Yeah.
And also interrupting when that is not happening. And so in terms of bystander intervention, also saying to yourself, when I see a female coworker being interrupted, geez, it seems it would be really hard for me to be able to say, you just interrupted her.
Yeah.
Let's
listen to what
finish.
she has to say.
And this is where the beauty of counseling communication comes in, right? And so it becomes, oh, geez, Gary, I love what you have started to share, but I was super compelled by what Susie over here was saying. I'm wondering if we can listen to her finish up.
Right.
And I share that with folks, and it's like, it would never occur to me to say it like that.
Of course
And
not.
I'm like, that's why I spent 3 years in a master's program relearning how to communicate
Yep,
in a
absolutely.
way that doesn't put people on the defensive.
Yeah.
Similarly, if you're interrupted or if you are, it's a tough, I know there's controversy around this word, but if you see another woman being mansplained in a meeting, again, hey, Gary, I'm wondering if you can share with us how that idea is different than what Susie shared 5 minutes ago.
Right.
Because it sounds very similar to me.
Yeah.
Instead of being like, you have just mansplained her, which then puts everyone again on the
Right.
defensive, and that is not the goal.
Right.
It's less about calling it out, but inviting in curiosity about what has just happened.
Yeah. Hi, Winston.
He's curious.
Yeah, Winston is curious about the set.
So those are two more concrete strategies that come to mind. I would say the other thing is really observing and then challenging our own language and the things that we say as women
Yes.
to ourselves and then about other women.
Yeah.
Because you would be amazed just being intentional about hearing yourself, the things that will slip out.
Yes.
And then once we can do it for ourselves, once we know our own identities and we can lead others because we know ourselves, once we recognize the bias in our own language, we can invite others in to explore their language in a similar way.
Yeah. And I think the invitation in that too would be to, when you're exploring that within yourself, to recognize it, have it be an area of growth, but also not judge yourself and beat yourself up about it, because I think that's kind of one place we all kind of go is like, oh, I've got these biases, I'm such a jerk, I like what am I doing, I can't believe I'm this awful person that's holding that I say these things. And it's kind of like, okay, well, a lot of biases, until you start looking at them, they didn't necessarily come from you. And so to be gentle with yourself, because then once you, like you were saying, once you're secure in who you are and your identity, and then taking that to help your team, you know,
Absolutely.
explore theirs, you're going to want to do it a similar way and be gentle and not judgmental, and to really be supportive in it.
And compassionate to
Yes.
the best extent we can. Self-compassion is so important in the
Yeah.
leadership development process, especially that judgment piece.
Yeah.
And before we receive feedback, when we receive feedback, then that judgment that we place on ourselves. And so one of the great exercises to do, often people receive 360 reviews.
Yes. So I'm going to pause you.
Yeah.
So for our audience, can you explain what a 360 review
Yes.
is?
Yeah. So a 360 review is really a survey that gets sent out to folks that work alongside you,
Yep.
beneath you, above you, potentially can be sent to clients,
Yep.
or vendors who also you have to work with. And it's almost like a performance evaluation from all of these varying perspectives.
Yep.
And you also get to do a self-evaluation in that too. What's interesting, and the exercise that I'm having our women do who are in the leadership program, is they all had to complete 360 before they entered their MBA program at Booth. And after our sessions, asking them, I need you to now go through this, because there are 3 types of feedback that are going to be in here. The first is critical objective feedback, which I want you to keep. Critical objective feedback looks at outcomes, looks at deliverables, looks at performance. Did you achieve these metrics and benchmarks?
Yeah, so like numbers and metrics.
Numbers, metrics, those sorts of things. If there was a goal, did you meet it? And if not, is there an explanation for
Right.
that? So critical objective feedback. Then we have critical subjective feedback, which looks at behavior, looks at potentially the way that you are dressed, or the way that you are potentially interacting with other folks,
sure.
and what people interpret
Yep.
those behaviors to signal or suggest. It is wholly subjective,
Right.
and socially constructed in
Yeah.
a lot of ways.
Sure, of course.
And then there's the third piece, which is positive feedback.
Yeah.
The best. The best. So what I tell them to do, I'm like, what I want you to do, highlight all the positive feedback. I want you to highlight all of the critical objective feedback. And then you're going to take a Sharpie marker and just redact
Yeah.
all of the critical subjective feedback, because
Yeah.
that no longer belongs to you.
Yeah.
And it is not in service of your own self-development, your leadership development, or where you want to go. It's somebody else's bias.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's really empowering, and would encourage folks, even if you don't have a 360, chances are you have some sort of performance management system. Really reading through and taking a good look at what is the feedback that I'm receiving, and what counts and what is nonsense.
Right. Right. And I would say, for people just in life, that's a huge lesson too. It's a huge lesson in your work life. But it's also a huge lesson in your life to recognize that, you know, how people react to you has nothing really to do with who you are. And so to your point, take a Sharpie and cross that interaction out, you know, I think can be really powerful for people.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, there's so much more I want to talk about, but we're also almost out of time.
Okay.
So if
This is like a whole semester of conversation.
I know there's so many things. Well, I will have to have you back
Okay.
on, and we'll talk
I
about
would love
either
that.
this or we'll talk about something else. So if there's one question I have forgotten to ask you, one point that you have been dying to like talk about and make sure people hear, what would that be? Or did we cover it all?
We covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah. Maybe. Okay. So you think on that.
Okay.
And I do have another question.
Okay,
I mean, I have a million more questions.
No, let's go with your question because it's your show.
Okay. So we sort of touched on it, but I really want to be explicit about how can women support women. And also, because our audience is not just filled with women, how can men support women in this process? And dare I say, how can women support men in supporting women?
It's a very multidimensional process. And the truth is we're all in it together.
Yeah.
The more folks who can succeed in an economy, the better, right?
Yeah.
Like that's of service to everyone. One of the things, and it's so interesting, when I started Encourage Coaching, I really just wanted to coach. And the business side of it, I didn't find myself particularly stellar at. And so I started going to networking events. And one of the things I found myself so turned off by, and I was sticking with female and women-based events, was that everyone, it just felt so transactional.
Yes.
And I was like, this isn't how networks are built, right?
Yeah.
Especially like relationship-based networks that are meaningful and supportive. So the transactionality of it, but then that there is only so much pie.
Yes.
And I'm not going to share my pie with
Yes.
anybody else.
Yep.
Which is just insanity to me.
Yes.
You make more pie.
Right.
You just keep making more because everybody gets an opportunity to do well then,
Yes.
right? And so when I started seeing that, I started having conversations with folks. We were talking about networks. And I really, when we think about networks, and there's some really great research out there about networks, how they're built, how they can best be leveraged. Take a peek at some research on open and closed networks and the difference between them. And for innovation, what is great, for building business, what is great, for decision making and efficiency.
Yeah. I think we just found our next episode topic.
Yeah.
Maybe.
But I find myself having a very open network. Like I am here today with you.
Yes.
And we had a 4-minute conversation after the workshop.
Correct.
One, because you were doing something really cool that belongs to you and your building. I wanted to support that.
Thank you.
You were supporting me. I have an opportunity to talk to all of your listeners, which is so generous, right? Back to this idea of Chicago generosity.
Yes.
I think networks, especially for women, need to be practicing more generosity with each other, and not thinking about what can you do for me, but what am I able to do for you? Because the moment we are able to demonstrate to somebody else we have a stake in them, that reciprocity, it's human instinct to want to give something back. So I think that's one of the main questions to be asking ourselves. What can I do for this woman who I've just met?
Yes.
And just asking her.
Yeah. How can I help you?
Yeah.
What are you working on? What are your priorities right now?
Yeah.
And like, how can I potentially help you in those in the near future?
Yeah.
Or immediate future. Yeah.
And be curious and never, I would say never ever close down a relationship unless it's become toxic to you. So there have been a few women who have reached out like, ooh, I think I'm interested in coaching. And then they're unable to find their way there.
Right, sure.
And I always say everyone finds their way to coaching in their own time. Are there other ways I can be helpful or of service?
Yep.
Either for your passion project or the business that you're building. And I met a woman at a networking event about a year ago. The coaching partnership for us didn't work out. But then what was so beautiful about this was I had shared with Kristin, my partner and I just closed on our very first home, which is incredibly exciting. It's something I never thought would happen for me. But we are going from a 2-bedroom condo into a 5-bedroom home.
Amazing.
And interior design, not my thing.
Yeah.
But it was one of the women who I
Yeah.
met a year ago who was unable to start coaching.
Yeah.
And so reached out to her. We had stayed in touch. She is now at University of Chicago working as well, changed over. And I was like, hey,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you might be able to help me with this. And she's like, oh my gosh, of course. When can we have lunch? When can I come over to your space?
Yeah.
And we are now sharing our services with each other. So
Brilliant.
now I'm going
Right.
to coach. She's going to interior design,
Yeah.
and we both benefit, right?
Right.
Because now our networks are open to each other.
Yeah.
And there is value to be had even when there is not financial value to be had. And I
Yes.
think that's something that really gets lost in networking too. So yeah, I think that's unless it is a toxic relationship that is not in service of you,
Yeah.
why are you closing the door on another human person just because they can't pay you right now?
Right. And, I'm a self-proclaimed kind of new age hippie too. So like, not just like they can't, I really feel like people come into your life for a reason, and it may or may not be a business or financial sort of relationship. And, it might be for a short amount of time. It might be for a long amount of time. But to your point, you never know why that person has come into your life. It's, I think, human nature to make assumptions about why they have come into our lives. But I think if you're open to just the possibility of who knows where this relationship will go, and not come at it from a, well, what's in it for me kind of perspective, amazing things can happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I 100% agree.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So the very last thing, because now we really are out of time.
Has it really already been 51 minutes?
Yeah, it really
Oh my
has.
gosh. You're a great conversationalist.
Oh, well, thank you. It was amazing topic, and you made it very easy to like flow through. So with that being said, in your brilliance and your wisdom of your 36 and a half years, if you had one thing or maybe a couple of things that you absolutely would want to tell your younger self or our audience about life,
Oh my gosh, so many things.
what would you say? All right, so many things.
I think the first thing I would tell my younger self is nothing is permanent. Wherever you find yourself today doesn't have to be where you're going to be tomorrow, and doesn't dictate where you're going to be a year from now, 5 years now, 10 years from now.
Totally.
It is possible to make meaning of every experience, positive or negative or middling, right?
Yeah.
In a way that can be of service to you. And every time I did something in my 20s, I was like, this is it. Or this has ruined my life, and I'm never going to get anywhere, and I'm never going to amount to anything. And if you're able to be open to connecting all of your experiences and recognizing they are of value because you made some meaning from it, I think that's one of the most important things. I mean, so many of the folks that I either work with through Encourage or work with as students at universities, whether it was DePaul or University of Texas at Austin or now Booth, every decision felt like the last decision they were going to ever make. And the truth is, as humans, we make 30,000 decisions a day, whether you believe it or not. It's 30,000.
100% believe it.
Which means every day we have 30,000 new chances to start a new path, go in a new direction, be courageous in some way. And so that would be the other piece. Find what aligns with your joy and get courageous about it.
Yes.
And that's something I wish I would have done 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But I was too scared.
I know.
And that's why it took me 10 years to get here, or 36 and a half years to get here, right?
But you're here now.
Right. And that would be when I was 25 being like, no, it's time for you to go back to school now. Don't be afraid of the debt.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid of what people will think because counseling is not lucrative, or of course she did that.
Right.
trying to break out of the box of what other people expected
Yeah.
of me, instead of just showing up and being who I was.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
recognizing that I can have joy in the things that I'm naturally good at.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
really thrive in those ways.
So powerful. So powerful. And that last bit is all about what our podcast is about, like finding your voice and then like owning it courageously, like not just finding it, but using it, which takes courage.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, okay. I just want to acknowledge your heart and your wisdom and your passion for this topic and the clear commitment that you have for the people that you serve. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. And thank you for having me and telling all of these stories. I can't wait to keep listening and watching.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Katie, where can people find you? Where can they connect with you?
Sure. So my email address is katie@encouragecoaching.org. Cell phone 708-704-8606. Ring me anytime. And then my coaching office is located up in Ravenswood, so 4256 North Ravenswood. And I see clients on Saturdays in person and then virtually on weeknights if that's something you're looking for.
Awesome. Thank you so much. As always, you can find me at thrivecoachingstudio.com. You can follow me on Instagram, Robinson Kristin, Kristin. You can find the podcast at cultivatingcouragepodcast.com. Subscribe wherever you consume us so that you never miss the opportunity to get that nudge you might need to live courageously with purpose, passion, and love. All right, everybody, that's a wrap. We'll see you next week. Bye.